Arrogant crushes it. She's so good at it.
Okay, you guys ready? What are we going to do today?
European Enlightenment, 17th and 18th century.
Boom! Something like that. Good news is we're going to start with Europe. We're coming back to the world that you know. So we're going to start with Europe today. This is going to be easy stuff, things that we talked about or have talked about. We're going to talk about Enlightenment. We're going to talk about the Scientific Revolution. We're going to talk about Industrial Revolution. And from that, then we're going to talk about colonization. And in this process, we're going to deal with India and the Middle East. Hopefully, I think I've told you this enough times. Okay, so here's North America, South America, England, Europe, Spain, Africa, Middle East, right? Russia, India, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia, something like that. Scale maybe off a little bit. If you remember, we first talked about this spot, right? So we talked about Europe, and then we talked about moving this direction. Then we shifted way the heck over here and talked about China and Japan with a little bit of India, tiny, tiny bit of India, because I didn't want to talk about India yet. I want to talk about India more now. But we also talked about how Europe was interacting. I mean, that was the whole point of your essay, right? Your next spot is going to go, let's see, here. India, Middle East, okay? North Africa. This will also have a connection with Europe. Hopefully you get the trend, each unit. I'm starting with the west. I'm actually starting with like the far west with the Americas, and then I'm going around the world to Asia, then to the Middle East. And where do you think we're going to end up again? Here. And as I'm doing this geographically, I'm also doing it chronologically. So this part was 1500s, basically discovery, 1500s and 1600s. This part, even though we spent a lot of time before 1500, the bulk of your question was really 1500 to 1700. 1750, we kind of moved ahead in time. This period is going to be closer 1750 to 1900. So with each region, we're going up at least 100 years, 150, maybe 200 years. Our very last region is to go right back here, and this will be 1900 to 2000. What do you think has happened in the 20th century that did not happen in the 16th century? What was the biggest difference? Knowing what we know about the three main themes of this class, which remember is the corporate knowledge, cultural identity, and cultural diffusion. And when we first introduced these concepts, we talked about the cultural diffusion between Europe and the Americas and Africa. And then, of course, you just finished a unit talking about the cultural diffusion between Europe and China and Japan. And in fact, some of the cultural diffusion between Japan and China itself, and Korea, we talked about. So now, we're 100 years later, and of course we're going to talk about the same cultural diffusion between Europe and Indian colonization and the Middle East colonization. So then what's going to happen in the last unit, the very last one of class, 20th century? When you think 20th century and you think history, what comes to mind?
World Wars.
Totally world wars. Absolutely world wars. It's exactly it. And what about the world wars? You don't need to know it now. We're not there. But just take a guess. What was the world war? How is this different than where we started? Start. End. Doesn't even matter what they are.
Corporate knowledge is larger.
Why do we have a world war. Do we have any world wars in 1500? Why not? Because they're just beginning, just even to discover that they even exist. But by the time you get to the 20th century, you cannot have a war. And again, you don't have to know this, but so many of you already do. Where does World War I start? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So we have the Eastern Front and we have the Western Front. The Eastern Front is between Russia and Germany, and Russia and Austria and the Ottomans. And the Western Front is going to be France, Belgium, England, and Germany. But why do we call it a world war? Who else is involved?
The world.
The United States, Japan, the world. The war starts with one person being assassinated in Europe, and yet the whole world gets caught in that. How did that happen? Because it certainly didn't happen here, but it does in the 20th century. Because we are tied to everything. And we have our fingers everywhere. And so you can't have a conflict in Europe without also having conflicts everywhere. Now I know you don't know this, I'll tell you. Your textbooks hate my interpretation of world history. The more recent your textbook, the less likely they're going to focus on Europe interacting with these people. Because they want to talk about how India and China and Japan were all kind of their own folks, and they didn't really care about Europe. And that Africa was on its own, and America was really on its own. And that Europe was just one of many. And you can make that argument, lots of your books do that. Especially the very recent world history textbooks. They go out of their way to put less attention on Europe. But for us, every single unit, I go back to Europe. Today you'd call that Eurocentric. Like we keep thinking about Europe as if it's the big deal. Okay, why do I do that?
One of Europe's goals was to go explore.
Yes, because it is a big deal. Why wasn't it China that went out? It's a question that you guys asked last unit. Why not Japan? What was it that caused Asia to be different than the West? And it's not because they were backwards. They had just as much technology. They didn't do it. Why do we have 2016 celebrated in China? Is that their calendar? Do they celebrate 2016 years since the birth of Christ? I mean, that's what the calendar starts from, right? Why do the Muslims have this calendar? Russia, Africa, South America. Because it moves. If you want to get the theme of this class, it's about the expansion of corporate knowledge through cultural diffusion. It's a different world in 1500, totally different world than it was in 2000. And it has to do with just how small the world is. So now we're kind of in the middle part. We know where we're going. We know we're going to end up with the world wars. And not just the world wars, of course. We're also going to talk about Cold War and decolonization, which you guys probably don't think about very much. It's not talked about as much, but it's a huge part of the Cold War.